Welcome to this video where we'll transform our unordered list of planets into an HTML table. To get started, I'll go back to our index.html file, expand the section that holds the unordered list of planets, and delete the list. Then I'll add an HTML table element. Then I'll add a table row, and finally table cells to hold the planets. If we save this page and go back to our browser, we now see our list of planets. If I add the border attribute to our table and set the value to 1, save the page, and go back to the browser, we now see the list of planets included inside of a table row. Back in our code, we'll see the border attribute displayed in red. And this is because the border attribute actually applies a style to the element. It puts a 1 pixel border around the table. And in a prior video, we mentioned we wanted to have separation of concerns, where the HTML is really just used for the markup. Which element, what content do we want displayed, and where do we want it displayed on the page? In order to apply styles, we should really use CSS. So what we'll do is we'll get rid of the border attribute and give this table an ID. Then we'll go up to the head and add a style block, then add some CSS style. Now, in looking at this CSS, we'll see that it's a little different than the CSS that we had written a couple videos back to apply some styles to our page. Although we'll be taking a deeper dive into CSS in the next playlist in this tutorial series, let's walk through these styles to understand what we're applying. So we start out by telling the CSS to go find the single HTML element on the page that has an ID of planet table. And we know we're looking for an ID because we've prefaced the ID value planet table with a pound sign. So if we go down in our code and we find the element that has an ID of planet table, we see that is the table. I've also specified comma TD. So we know that these styles, wrapped within the curly braces, will be applied to the HTML element with the ID of planet table, which is the table itself, and TD, the HTML table cells that are contained within. And when we specify an HTML element as a selector in CSS, it will find all the HTML elements of that type, in our case, all the TDs, so all the table cells listing the planet names, in the code and apply these styles. Now, looking at the styles themselves, we'll see there's a difference between the colors that we added in our previous version of the CSS and what I have here now. Now, previously, I had specified the colors using the color names, black and white. In this case, I'm using hexadecimal values for the colors. And the reason we use hexadecimal values over the color names is because the hex values give us a broader palette of colors to choose from. If we go to the HTML hex colors page on W3 Schools, we'll see that in HTML, a color can be specified using a hexadecimal value in the form of red, green, and blue, where the red, green, and blue values are between 0 and 255. Now, using the sliders on the page, you can adjust the red, green, and blue values until you find a color that you like, then copy the hex value and paste it in your code. Going back to our code, we'll see that I've used the hex value of pound all zeros for black and pound all F for white. I've also applied a padding of 10 pixels and a margin to the planet table and table cells. And then I've overwritten the background color of black to the background color of white in the table cells and changed the color of the font to navy blue. So if we go back to our page and view it in the browser, we'll see that the table has a black border and black background color, and the table cells contained within the table in this single table row have a background color of white and a text of navy blue. Now let's go back to our code and make some modifications to our table. First, I'd like to delete the H2 for the planets header and add that as a row inside of our table. Now you'll notice that I've applied 2 attributes to the table cell, the TD, inside of the new table row in our table. I've given it an ID of planets header, so we could probably guess that we're going to apply some styles to this, but I've also set the call span attribute equal to 8. And the reason that I did this is because there are 8 table cells in the second row. So in order for this table row with 1 table cell to span the entire length of the table, I want this table cell to take up 8 columns. So basically I'm saying make the width of this table row the same as the width of this table row. So if we go back to the browser and take a look at this, we'll see that we now have 2 table rows, one with the planet's header and one row with a list of table cells for the planets themselves, and both rows span the entire length of the table. Now let's go back to the code and apply the styles for the ID planets header. Let's scroll up to our style block and add a new style. So what this style does is it says find the HTML element with the ID of planets header and change the size of its font to 1.5 M. And also align the text center within its container. And in this case, the container happens to be the table cell inside of the table row. So if we save this and go back to the browser, now we see that the planets header is centered inside of its row, and that its font size is 1.5 times bigger than the default font size on the page. Now what I'd like to do is modify our table from having 2 rows to look like this table with multiple rows and different table cells. So we'll start with an overall heading of satellites. We'll identify the planets and the moons that they have. Each planet will have its own row and will have 2 cells. If the planet has a moon, the moon will be listed in the second cell. If the planet doesn't have a moon, the second cell will be empty. So let's jump back in our code and make those modifications. First, I'll delete all the content within the table and create 3 table rows for the satellites, planets, and moons headers. If we save the code, go back to the browser, we see our 3 headers. Next, let's scroll to the top and add our styles for those headers. We save the code and go back to the browser, we'll see that the formatting has slightly changed. Now, let's add our table rows for Mercury and Venus. Each of these planets has 1 table row with 2 table cells. Because they have no moons, the second table cell is empty, or in this case, we've added a non-blank space character. So this will give some context to the cell. So we save this now, revisit the browser, we'll see under our headers, we have Mercury and Venus with 2 cells in the table row, the second cell being empty. Now, let's add our table row for Earth. And since Earth has a moon, the second table cell has actual content in it. We can see this in the browser. So we have all of our satellites. The planets are listed in the left column of each table row, and the moons, if the planet has one, in the right. Otherwise, the cell is empty. Finally, let's add a table row for Mars. Let's go back to the browser, and we'll see Mars has been added to the column for planets, and it has 2 table cells for its 2 moons. Let's look at this implementation. So for Mars, we've actually added 2 table rows. The first row has 2 cells, one for the planet and one for its first moon. We've added the row span attribute set to 2 because we want Mars, the planet, to take up 2 rows in the table, because we need table cells for each planet on their own row. Again, if we look at the browser, we have 2 rows with 1 table cell for each moon, and Mars takes up 1 table cell which spans 2 rows. The second table row has 1 table cell for the second planet, and we only need 1 table cell in this case because the row above spans 2 rows. So again, if we go back to the browser, Mars spans 2 rows. So Mars is the first table cell in the first row for the first moon. It's also the first table cell in the row for the second moon. Finally, I'd like to modify this table to use more semantic HTML elements and give the table more structure. So I'll start by deleting the existing code we have for the table and pasting in some new code that we'll look at together. Before we look at the actual HTML for the table, I want to scroll up to our head and delete the style block. What I'm going to do is paste in some new code, which we'll use to reference an external style sheet. Again, this goes back to separation of concerns, where we really only want the HTML in the .html file. And any styles that are applied to our HTML, we'd like to include in an external style sheet. So here, I'm referencing an external style sheet in a folder called CSS in a file called styles.css. So I need to come over here inside of our HTML folder, create a new folder named CSS, and a new file named styles.css, and then I'll paste in some styles. So these styles target the HTML element with the ID of planet table, as well as the table header and a table cell to set its border, padding, and margin. And then we're targeting a table footer to set the text align and font size. Now what's different to us in this style sheet, in addition to being external, is the addition of the TH, the table header element, and the TFoot, the table footer element. These are semantic HTML elements that we use inside of the HTML table tag. Going back to the HTML and looking at the table, we see now that we have three primary sections within the table. We have a table header, a table footer, and then the table body. If we expand the table header, we see we have two rows with new th table head elements. If we go back and look at the page in the browser, we'll now see our two table header rows. The first row takes up 2 columns, the second row has 2 cells. If we look at the table footer, we see you have a table row with a table cell, which has a link to Wikipedia. View that in a browser. Here's our table cell. And finally, the table body contains content for the table. And these are the table rows and table cells that we previously defined in our last HTML example. So by using semantic HTML elements, we've made the code easier to read, easier to understand, and we've also applied some additional styles to change the look of the table on the web page. In our next and final video in the HTML tutorial series, we'll look at HTML forms.